What's up, everyone? Reacting to a question I asked on Theories of Everything with Curt Jaimungal, with Thomas Campbell. So he said he's gonna have Thomas Campbell on. What questions would you like asked to them? So I said, question for Thomas Campbell. You have stated that your model assumes two things: consciousness exists and evolution exists. However, if the objective of science is to explain more with less, and more so to explain the most with the least, then wouldn't the simplest final step be to literally explain everything with nothing, rather than to explain everything with consciousness? Why would something as complex as consciousness be more fundamental than literally nothingness as the true foundation from which all arises?
It has a relationship to energy.
Yeah, right. That's
Okay,
true.
well-
Yeah, he's just poking little logical holes in these beliefs that physicists have. Sure.
Okay, last question. This one's fairly easy for you to answer. It says,
Repair masculinity. My username is Repairman Scully. So it goes.
you have stated that your model assumes two things: consciousness and evolution.
Feel like I'm getting fucked with here. Repairman Scully comes from Repairman Jack, a book series I used to read as a kid by F. Paul Wilson. I started to use Repairman with Scully, and when I was like 15, that's just been like the username I use a lot of the time.
However, if the objective of science is to explain, it has a relationship to energy.
Yeah, right. That's
Okay,
true.
well-
Yeah, he's just poking little logical holes in these beliefs that physicists have. Sure.
Okay, last question. This one's fairly easy for you to answer. It says, you have stated that your model assumes two things: consciousness and evolution. However, if the objective of science is to explain more with less, wouldn't the final simplest step be to explain everything with nothing, rather than to explain everything with consciousness? So why would something as seemingly complex as consciousness be more fundamental than nothing as the true foundation?
Okay, that's easy to answer. Nothing doesn't take you any place. It's like you can answer every question with God.
It's funny he said it doesn't take you on your place, and then he goes on and says you can answer every question with God.
God does it.
God
Why is
does
it raining today?
That's where nothing takes us, though, is to recognize that God does it. God does it. Yes, it takes us there. And it shows the infinite nature of reality and from which it comes, which is nothingness.
Oh, God does it. Why did my car, stop? God does it. Everything. So there's just one answer for everything. God does it.
Yes.
All right. Well, what's wrong with that? It's not anything logically wrong with that, in the sense that you could say that.
Especially if it's true.
There's an assumption.
Right.
God exists and God.
Assumption, maybe. It's not necessarily an assumption. It may be a conclusion that is arrived at from a model that's based in nothingness as the foundation of all it is, that it gives rise to infinity, which ultimately is God. From nothing comes God, which is everything, which is you and I and everything else.
God does everything, right? That's the assumption. But given that assumption, then...
And since we're everything, God is everything, God does do everything.
That's logical. God does everything. But what's wrong with that little piece of logic is that it doesn't go anywhere.
Except for describing the actual nature of what is going on. In that God is everything, and that's true. And it allows us to see what is. And that's useful. It's useful to see what is for what it is.
It doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't explain anything. It doesn't give you
And yet it explains everything.
any insight. It doesn't help.
That's what a theory of everything is a theory of nothing. They're the same thing. Nothing and everything, they're the same.
Help you understand. You see, it's like the null set.
Okay, then I have a better theory.
It's almost useless.
I have a better theory.
It's just
God,
hey now.
statement.
God did everything, and you're not meant to understand. There.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Not meant to understand it, and maybe that's so.
Now take that.
Well, it's the same thing. Okay, so what does that?
And yet, we are God. That's the thing. It's not like a separate and distinct entity to be God. God is everything. And so we are meant to understand it because we're coming to. It's just where we're arriving right now. And so therefore we're meant to
Help me do.
You're not meant to. You're not meant to be helped.
I'm not meant to understand, so it's not useful. You see, it doesn't have any.
Useful.
It doesn't have any function. Yeah, it's not meant to be useful. But see, people.
It's simple and it's true and it is useful. It's just a matter of seeing the full extent of its usefulness, to recognize that nothing is the foundation from which everything comes. It really explains things in a way that nothing else, no individual component of all that is, can explain. Only the opposite of all, that is equal and opposite, which is nothingness, can actually provide a wide enough spectrum so that the full extent of all that is can exist between the boundaries.
Like things that, like meaning, they like to understand. They like to be able to predict. They like to be able to say, well, you know, if I do this and then that and that, this is going to happen. They'd like to be able to find reasons for things, explanations. What do we call it? Consequences. All of that kind of stuff is important to people, to understand the reality. Why do you feel the way you do? Why does this happen? Why does that happen? You know, why is the sky blue? All these things. You know, well, God made it blue. Well, that doesn't tell you anything. You know, if you understand about light scattering and the wavelength of the light and the particle sizes that are there, then you can, oh, that makes sense. Okay, that's, you know, why we have seasons.
And yet it's like a surface analysis. Whereas if you really dig deeper to get to the root of things, God did it kind of explanation is more accurate and universal.
You know, why it gets from light to dark. You know, all these things help us understand our world better and help us make better choices, as here we are to make choices. And if we can't make any choices because we don't know anything, then everything's random and nothing has any purpose or any point. So the reason that that is not a good answer isn't that it's necessarily illogical.
Knowing nothing is the beginning of knowledge, in a sense. Truly knowing nothing. Not just being like, I don't know anything. But knowing nothing is the beginning of knowledge. Without that, it's just, it's just like a wave. It's going to only go so high. It's only going to go so low. So if the foundation is only so low through the layers of all that exists, if it's not the foundation of nothingness, then the opposite peak that it will perceive is only going to be so high, the equivalent but opposite in a wave of the peak rather than the trough. But if the trough goes down to zero, then the peak goes up to infinity. And so it actually spans the entire spectrum. Whereas something with just like consciousness, for example, as the foundation will only go so high, it doesn't, consciousness doesn't have a counter pole of infinity. Like they're not opposites. And so it doesn't lead to an infinite picture, which is descriptive of the actual nature of reality.
God does it and you're not supposed to know, then that's an assumption, and it goes nowhere.
It can be an assumption, but it can also be a conclusion. Gotta reiterate that. It's an assumption to say it's an assumption.
It offers nothing. It just leaves you empty. Whereas a solution that actually gives you a model, here's how reality.
Nothing is everything. So maybe it appears empty, but it's actually as full as can be.
Works. Oh, you're miserable and unhappy? Well, here's where happiness comes from. Here's how it works. Here's how you end up with that.
So like, here's where happiness comes from, but like, that's within the spectrum of consciousness. Within that wavelength, or whatever, the amplitude. But it doesn't step outside of that to the true extent of nothingness. Because it's more than consciousness. Like there's unconscious levels of reality that are so subconscious that they're unconscious. And that's outside of the spectrum, but it's part of reality. Because reality is infinite and doesn't have boundaries except for the ultimate boundaries of nothing and everything, where those boundaries are really the one and the same. So like a graph that goes from 0 to infinity, it looks like it's a line, but really it loops back around, and 0 is infinity. They're at the same point in space.
You see, oh, the sky's blue. Well, here's why that sky's blue. It helps you.
Which is even representative in a graph when, when the y-axis has the equation go to infinity, and then it reaches a limit where suddenly the line starts from the other side, and we're like, well, that's undefined. That's an undefined limit because it approaches positive infinity divided by 2, and then it suddenly shows up at minus infinity divided by 2, and it's like, how did that happen? It's because they're disconnected. Well, maybe they're not disconnected. Maybe it truly loops around and comes up from the bottom, and that's because it does loop around. Even when we make the graph just have 2 dimensions and not have that looping, just by having infinity involved, it does loop.
Create technology. It helps you build things. We have internets. We can do.
Like this model, for instance, recognizing that infinity is the root of all zero, nothingness is the root of all things and leads to infinity. It basically leads to larger and larger particles and smaller, and the smaller and smaller ones move faster and faster within a certain range of smaller and smaller. They are so small that their mass is perceivably zero, and so we call it light. But they can be even smaller to the point where they're moving at an infinite velocity, and then all we call that is the cumulative effect of all of the particles, which we call gravity. So gravity is caused by particles moving in a flow, and so that flow can be focused so that many flows merge into one. And so if we could tap into that with a technology that's really just focusing the ether, then, I mean, having a model that's based in nothing would lead to actual useful technology. Anyway, that's my reaction. I gotta go. Thanks for asking the question. That's my 2 cents on the circumstances. Once I heard the response, thought I'd just go ahead and react. So later.